At an exclusive gala, a millionaire publicly insulted a black guest, claiming she didn't belong. His son, suspecting a family secret, secretly ordered a DNA test that proved she was actually his half-sister, making her entitled to half of everything their father owned. The millionaire's prejudice had exposed his own hidden past. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Grand Majestic Hotel shimmered, a colossal edifice of polished marble and glittering chandeliers. Ava, in a sleek midnight blue gown, felt a familiar pang of self-doubt. This gala, a pinnacle of the city's elite, felt less like a celebration and more like a carefully constructed fortress, excluding those deemed unworthy. The air hummed with the low thrum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume hung heavy, a cloying sweetness that masked the undercurrent of simmering tensions. Arthur Sterling, the host, loomed nearby, a monument of imperious wealth. His tailored suit seemed to absorb the light, casting him in an almost intimidating shadow. His face, etched with lines of self-importance and barely concealed disdain, scanned the room with a cold, appraising gaze. Ava, despite her considerable success as an architect, felt utterly insignificant, a mere speck in this glittering galaxy of the privileged. She adjusted her posture, a silent act of defiance against the invisible walls that separated her from this world. The weight of her ambition pressed down, a heavy cloak she couldn't quite shed. She knew she needed to make connections, yet the air crackled with an unspoken hostility that made networking feel like an impossible feat. The champagne flute felt cold against Ava's fingertips, its chill a stark contrast to the burning humiliation rising in her chest. Arthur Sterling's words, barbed and cruel, echoed in her ears. "You don't belong here," he'd sneered, his voice a low growl that sliced through the polite murmur of the gala. The memory stung, a raw wound refusing to heal. She looked around, the glittering chandeliers seeming to mock her pain. Each clinking glass, each whispered conversation, felt like a tiny hammer blow against her already fragile composure. Julian Sterling, Arthur's son, watched from across the room. He'd seen his father's outburst, the casual cruelty etched on his face. A wave of disgust washed over him, a familiar feeling that had grown stronger in the last few years. He'd felt an inexplicable pull towards Ava, a strange kinship that defied logic and social boundaries. This woman, so clearly out of place yet undeniably elegant, possessed a strength that resonated with him. He saw her struggle to maintain her composure, the slight tremble of her hand, the way she held her head high despite the blatant insult. It was in that moment, amidst the opulent chaos, that he knew he had to act. He couldn't stand by and watch his father perpetuate such blatant injustice. He excused himself, his steps purposeful. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him, a burden that threatened to crush him under its weight. Yet, the growing sense of unease, the nagging suspicion about a hidden family secret, propelled him forward. He needed answers. He had to know the truth. The consequences, however daunting, paled in comparison to the moral imperative that clawed at his conscience. The fate of this woman, and perhaps the truth about his family's carefully constructed facade, rested in his hands. The plush velvet of the restroom seat offered little comfort. Ava pressed her fingertips to her eyes, the cool porcelain of the sink a welcome contrast to the burning shame spreading through her. Arthur Sterling's words, a venomous cocktail of prejudice and power, replayed on a loop in her mind, each syllable a fresh wound. The scent of expensive lilies, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a cloying reminder of the opulent cage she'd briefly entered, only to be brutally rejected. A soft knock echoed, followed by a hesitant voice. "Miss Sharma? It's Julian Sterling." Ava straightened, surprised. She'd barely registered his presence at the gala, too consumed by her own mortification. She dabbed at her eyes, smoothing her dress. "Come in," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. Julian entered. His eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Was it guilt? He closed the door softly behind him. The subdued lighting of the restroom highlighted the worry lines etched around his eyes, a stark contrast to his impeccably tailored suit. I saw what happened," he began, his voice low. "My father's behavior was unacceptable." Ava managed a weak smile. Unacceptable is an understatement. The words felt heavy, laden with the weight of years of similar experiences. I wanted to apologize," Julian continued, his gaze unwavering, "on behalf of my father, and well, on behalf of myself too, for the way he made you feel, and for everything." His admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The quiet sincerity in his voice surprised her. It was different from the polite, distant exchanges she'd observed between him and his father earlier. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a shared understanding that transcended their vastly different worlds. A shared feeling of injustice, perhaps. "Thank you," Ava whispered, her voice catching. "It means more than you know." He hesitated, then continued, "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been trying to figure out for a long time, and it might change everything." The unspoken words hung between them, a tangible weight in the quiet intimacy of the restroom. The scent of lilies was almost forgotten now, replaced by the sharp, nervous scent of Julian's cologne and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Ava felt a knot tightening in her stomach, a sense of foreboding tinged with a flicker of something else, hope. The possibility of truth felt almost as terrifying as the injustice she'd just endured. Julian's confession hung unspoken, a heavy weight in the hushed intimacy of the restroom. The cool porcelain of the sink seemed to amplify the tremor in Ava's hands as she smoothed her silk dress, the fabric whispering against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough edges of her emotions. Outside, the muffled sounds of the gala, the clinking of champagne flutes, the murmur of polite conversation, felt distant, unreal. Here, in this small private space, the world narrowed to the shared space between her and Julian Sterling, a man whose father had just publicly humiliated her. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, the scent of lilies now replaced by a sharp, metallic tang that Ava realized was fear her own. A fear laced with a flicker of something else, a fragile hope that threatened to shatter if exposed to the harsh reality of the situation. Julian shifted his weight, his tailored suit creaking subtly. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers lingering before producing a small, unmarked envelope. I collected a sample," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "At the bar earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling. This strange connection I felt, seeing you there. It was irrational, I know." He offered her the envelope, his gaze pleading. Ava stared at it, the plain white paper a stark contrast to the opulence she'd just escaped. The possibility that this ordinary piece of paper held the key to a truth so profound, so devastating, paralyzed her. The knot in her stomach tightened, a cold dread spreading through her veins. She finally reached for it, her fingers trembling, as if she were touching something fragile, something that could break with the slightest touch. What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A DNA test," Julian replied, his voice strained. "For you and my father." He swallowed hard, his eyes betraying a mixture of fear and determination. He continued, "I know it's a huge leap, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. The feeling that something wasn't right about my father's reaction, about everything." Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of Ava's own heart, pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cool air of the restroom seemed to suddenly turn frigid, the plush velvet seat feeling suddenly uncomfortable, unfamiliar. The weight of decades of subtle slights, of overlooked talent, of prejudice so deeply ingrained that it was invisible to most, now seemed to concentrate its force in this small, sterile space. The weight was almost unbearable. Yet within this profound unease a spark of cautious hope ignited, fragile yet persistent. The possibility, however improbable it seemed, was a lifeline in the overwhelming current of her humiliation. Ava looked up at Julian, her gaze meeting his with a newfound intensity. The game, it seemed, was about to change. The envelope felt strangely cold against Ava's fingertips, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the feverish heat rising in her chest. The mirrored surface of the restroom sink reflected her pale face, the shock etched deep into her features. The opulent sounds of the gala, once a backdrop of glittering ambition, now felt miles away, replaced by the frantic beat of her heart. Julian watched her, his own face drawn and pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The lilies he'd earlier admired, their scent now a faint memory, were replaced by the metallic tang of fear. "My father," Ava began, her voice a mere breath, the words catching in her throat. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She thought of her father, the man who'd instilled in her the strength to endure, the resilience to overcome obstacles, the man who now lay shattered somewhere inside this carefully constructed facade of privilege. Julian nodded, his gaze filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. He's always been guarded, distant. I always suspected something, a disconnect. But this, he gestured towards the envelope, his voice cracking slightly. This confirms it. A wave of nausea washed over Ava. The possibility, once a fleeting thought, now loomed large, terrifying, and yet strangely liberating. The years of feeling overlooked, undervalued, the constant struggle against the invisible walls of prejudice, all coalesced into a single, potent emotion: anger. A quiet, simmering anger that threatened to erupt. "What if it's wrong?" she whispered, the question a desperate plea against the overwhelming tide of uncertainty. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The polished marble of the countertop felt cold and unyielding beneath her trembling hands. Julian's eyes softened, his gaze conveying a depth of empathy she hadn't expected. "I understand your hesitation, Ava, but I couldn't just stand by and watch him dehumanize you like that. It felt wrong on so many levels." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Besides," he added, a faint smile touching his lips, "if it is, then you are family." The sterile white of the restroom only amplified Ava's trembling. The scent of expensive lilies, usually a symbol of opulence, now felt cloying, suffocating. Julian's hand, hovering near hers, offered silent comfort. He shifted, the soft rustle of his tailored suit a counterpoint to the frantic thump of Ava's heart. It's hard to believe," she whispered, her voice catching. The DNA results, a stark black and white confirmation, felt surreal. "I know," Julian murmured, his own voice strained. He looked at the discarded envelope, its pristine surface now crumpled, a testament to the seismic shift in their lives. "But the evidence, it's undeniable." His gaze held hers, a mixture of empathy and dawning fear. The weight of the secret, previously a heavy stone in his chest, now felt like a volcanic eruption threatening to consume them both. Ava's eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and ambition, were clouded with disbelief. The opulent gala, with its shimmering lights and champagne flutes, receded into a distant, unreal memory. In its place was a stark landscape of betrayal and a lifetime of unspoken truths. She thought of her father, the man who had instilled in her strength, the man whose quiet pride now seemed a carefully constructed illusion. "What about him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, unsaid yet palpable between them. Julian swallowed, the movement hard, tense. "My father, he's built his life on lies. He's always been distant, emotionally unavailable. I always knew something was wrong, but I never imagined this." He traced a pattern on the cool marble countertop, his knuckles bone white. "This changes everything." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the faint hum of the ventilation system and the erratic rhythm of their shared breathing. The potential consequences loomed: a legal battle, family fracturing, the shattering of a meticulously crafted public image. Yet, alongside the fear, a strange sense of liberation flickered. A shared secret, a shared injustice, a nascent bond of kinship forged in the crucible of betrayal. The scent of lilies was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of antiseptic. The cold reality settled upon them, a heavy blanket in the otherwise warm, opulent confines of the restroom. The restroom door clicked shut, sealing them in a bubble of hushed anxiety. The cool marble felt strangely comforting against Ava's trembling fingers. Julian watched her, a silent guardian in his impeccably tailored suit. The faint hum of the ventilation system seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the gala just beyond the door. "It feels unreal," Ava whispered, her voice catching. The crisp white tiles mirrored the starkness of the DNA results, a cruel juxtaposition to the opulent setting they'd just left. The champagne bubbles, the laughter, the glittering lights all seemed a lifetime away. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "I know. It's a lot to process." He reached for a tissue, his hands slightly trembling, and dabbed at a bead of sweat on his forehead. The weight of his secret, the fear of shattering his carefully constructed world, pressed down on him. Ava ran a hand through her meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. "My father, I don't understand." Her voice was barely a breath, tinged with confusion and a deep, underlying hurt. The image of Arthur's sneering face, his cruel words echoing in her ears, intensified her pain. "He built his life on a lie," Julian said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "The distance, the coldness. I always sensed something was off. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "This changes everything." The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft rustling of the tissue in Julian's hand. The enormity of the revelation hung between them, a heavy, suffocating presence. The future, once clear and bright, now seemed shrouded in uncertainty. Yet, amidst the fear and disbelief, a flicker of something else ignited. A shared understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of a devastating secret. A fragile hope began to bloom amidst the ruins of their carefully constructed lives. The antiseptic scent of the restroom, once sterile and cold, now felt oddly cleansing. A new chapter, fraught with challenges but brimming with the potential for truth and justice, was about to begin. The restroom door clicked shut, a small, almost insignificant sound swallowed by the vastness of the gala's echoing grandeur. Ava leaned against the cool marble, the polished surface a stark contrast to the rough texture of her suddenly trembling hands. The scent of antiseptic, usually sharp and clinical, felt oddly comforting, a grounding presence in the swirling chaos of her emotions. Julian watched her, the dim light reflecting in his worried eyes. His impeccably tailored suit, usually a symbol of his effortless grace, now seemed to hang heavy, burdened by the weight of his secret. "I still can't believe it," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible above the faint hum of the ventilation system. The words felt alien, disconnected from the reality of the DNA results clutched in Julian's hand. The champagne flutes, the glittering jewels, the effortless smiles of the elite, all seemed to mock the raw vulnerability she felt. Julian nodded, his throat tight. "Me neither, but it's true." He shifted uncomfortably, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly feeling constricting. The fear that had gnawed at him for weeks now threatened to consume him entirely. The potential fallout, the destruction of his carefully constructed family image, loomed large. Ava ran a hand through her hair, the gesture revealing the turmoil within. The image of Arthur's sneering face, his callous words echoing in her ears, felt like a physical blow. He said I didn't belong," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. "That I was an intruder." The sting of his words, coupled with the revelation of their shared blood, felt like a betrayal on a scale she couldn't comprehend. Julian's gaze softened. He understood the depth of her pain, the years of quiet resilience masked by her polished exterior. "He built his empire on a lie," he said softly, his voice laced with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The distance, the coldness, it wasn't just arrogance. It was fear. Fear of his own past catching up to him. He paused, searching for the right words. This changes everything for both of us, Ava. Everything. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. The sterile scent of the restroom seemed to amplify the enormity of their shared secret, a shared burden that linked them in a way neither could have ever imagined. The future, once a path seemingly laid out before them, was now a tangled, uncertain labyrinth. Yet, in the shared shock and disbelief, a fragile hope flickered, a connection forged in the crucible of a devastating truth. The possibility of justice, of reclaiming their stolen heritage, began to dawn. A new chapter, however fraught with challenges, had begun. The restroom's cool marble felt like a comforting weight against Ava's back. The hum of the ventilation system was a low drone against the roaring silence in her ears. Julian watched her, his usually sharp features softened by concern. He hadn't anticipated this level of devastation. The polished surfaces of the gala hall, moments before a whirlwind of glittering lights and forced smiles, now felt a million miles away. The champagne's effervescence seemed a cruel mockery of her inner turmoil. He said I didn't belong, Ava whispered, her voice catching. The words, stripped bare of their initial shock, now resonated with a profound sadness. The years of striving, of overcoming subtle slights and blatant dismissals, felt suddenly meaningless in the face of Arthur's casual cruelty. Julian's jaw tightened. He'd seen his father's prejudice before, a cold, sneering contempt that had always unsettled him. But the DNA results, stark and undeniable, had ripped away the carefully constructed facade of his father's life. He thought of the times he'd felt an inexplicable pull towards Ava, a kinship that defied logic and social standing. Now it made horrifying sense. His empire, he built it on a lie, Julian said, his voice low. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that warred with the familiar loyalty he felt towards his father. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about a lifetime of denial, of carefully cultivated deceit. Ava looked up, her eyes glistening. A lie built on my exclusion. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. It wasn't just about being insulted. It was about a life denied, opportunities missed, a sense of belonging deliberately withheld. Julian reached out, his hand hovering over hers. The gesture was hesitant, unsure, but the unspoken empathy bridging the gap between them was palpable. He knew he couldn't fix the past, but he could offer support, a shared understanding in the face of a shared trauma. It's not your fault, Ava. None of this is your fault. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the faint sounds from the gala hall, a constant reminder of the world beyond their secluded refuge. The weight of their shared secret pressed down on them, a heavy burden, yet also a fragile thread connecting them, a bond forged in the crucible of a devastating truth. The future, once a clear path, was now an uncertain journey, but together, they were ready to embark on it. The restroom's cool marble offered little solace. Ava stared at her reflection, the glittering lights of the gala hall distorted in the mirror's surface, mocking the wreckage of her composure. The scent of expensive perfume, usually a symbol of luxury, now felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of the opulent cage she'd been trapped within. Julian's hand, warm and surprisingly comforting, rested lightly on hers. His silent presence offered a fragile lifeline in the swirling vortex of her emotions. I can't believe he said that, Ava whispered, her voice trembling. The words, once a searing insult, now felt like a dull ache, a constant reminder of the casual cruelty that permeated the gilded world she'd briefly inhabited. The champagne she'd sipped earlier tasted like ash in her mouth. Julian squeezed her hand gently. It's not true, Ava. None of it is true. He knew the words offered little comfort, but he needed to say them, to solidify the truth between them against the tide of lies. The weight of the secret pressed heavily upon him. The DNA results, clutched tightly in his pocket, felt like a burning brand. The low hum of the ventilation system became a mournful dirge, a soundtrack to their shared devastation. The ornate silver tap, reflecting the fractured image of their faces, seemed to mock their shattered world. Ava's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a profound sadness, a weariness that spoke of years spent battling prejudice, only to be so brutally confronted with its reality. But it felt true, Ava said, her voice barely a breath. The sting of Arthur's words, the condescending sneer, the blatant dismissal, they'd pierced her carefully constructed shield of resilience. The years of struggle, the silent battles against systemic biases, now felt utterly pointless. Julian shifted, unable to bear witness to her despair. He rose, his gaze falling on the elegant, yet impersonal, restroom. The cold, hard surfaces reflected the harsh reality of their situation. He turned back to Ava. "It's a lie, Ava, a carefully constructed lie," he repeated, his voice firm. "And we're going to unravel it together." The strength in his voice, the fierce protectiveness, offered her a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. The path ahead was uncertain, the battles yet to come daunting. But for the first time that night, Ava felt a flicker of determination ignite within her. The fight had begun. The cool air of the restroom, a stark contrast to the stifling opulence of the gala, did little to soothe Ava's burning cheeks. The scent of lilies, usually a favorite, now felt cloying, a cruel parody of the elegance she'd strived for. She stared at her reflection, her usually vibrant eyes dulled with a profound sadness. Julian's presence beside her, a silent anchor in the storm, was a comfort she hadn't expected. I can't believe he actually said that," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The words, Arthur's venomous dismissal, echoed in the cavernous space of her mind. Each syllable, a poisoned dart aimed at her heart. Julian squeezed her hand, his touch grounding, reassuring. "It's not true, Ava," he said, his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the turmoil raging within her. The DNA results, a crumpled piece of paper burning a hole in his pocket, felt like a tangible weight of responsibility. "But it felt true," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns of the marble floor. The years of subtle slights, the overlooked achievements, the constant struggle against ingrained prejudice. Arthur's words had given voice to a lifetime of unspoken anxieties. His cruel pronouncements had resonated with a painful truth, a truth she'd fought so hard to ignore. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the ventilation system and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet. The cold, polished surfaces of the restroom seemed to amplify the desolation she felt, reflecting the fractured image of her self-esteem. He rose, his gaze sweeping over the opulent, yet impersonal, space. The gilded cage, the symbol of wealth and power, felt like a prison. He turned back to Ava, his eyes filled with a determined resolve. "It's a lie, Ava," he repeated, his voice firm, his tone infused with a quiet strength. "A carefully constructed lie, built on years of deceit and prejudice, and we're going to unravel it together." His words were a promise, a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of her despair. The fight, he knew, would be long and arduous. But in that moment, shared in the sterile calm of the restroom, a fragile alliance was forged, a shared determination to expose the truth. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time that night, a flicker of hope ignited within Ava's heart, a spark of defiance against the darkness. The fight, she realized, had truly begun. The mirrored walls of the restroom seemed to multiply Julian's own simmering anger. The scent of expensive soap couldn't mask the metallic tang of anxiety clinging to the air. He watched Ava, her shoulders slumped, the elegant dress clinging to her like a shroud. The opulent gala, a spectacle of shimmering lights and forced smiles, felt a million miles away. Here, in the stark, cold reality of the restroom, the veneer of sophistication had cracked, revealing the raw wound of Arthur's cruelty. He didn't even look at me," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light like a tiny, glittering jewel. Julian felt a surge of protective anger. The crumpled DNA test results in his pocket felt heavier than ever. His father's words, his casual dismissal of Ava, were a betrayal of everything Julian believed in. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently covering it. "He's a fool," Julian said, his voice low and steady, trying to infuse it with the conviction he felt but wasn't entirely sure he possessed. Blind to the truth, blinded by his own arrogance. Ava looked up, her eyes searching his. "But what if he's right? What if I don't belong?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of self-doubt. Years spent navigating a world that consistently underestimated her. Julian squeezed her hand tighter. "He's wrong, terribly wrong, and I'm going to prove it." He hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. The truth, he knew, could shatter everything: his family, his father's carefully constructed image, even his own sense of self. Yet, the sight of Ava's vulnerability fueled his determination. "There's something I need to tell you." His voice was barely a breath, yet the unspoken words hung heavy between them, a tangible promise of revelation. The cool porcelain of the sink seemed to mirror the chill that settled over Ava, a mixture of apprehension and a fragile, nascent hope. The fight was far from over, but in the quiet intimacy of that small restroom, an alliance had been forged, a silent vow to face the storm together. The opulent ballroom, a swirling vortex of champagne flutes and hushed conversations, felt a million miles away. Julian slipped through a side door, the heavy oak groaning a silent protest against his hurried passage. He found himself in a dimly lit corridor, the polished marble cool beneath his shoes. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and something faintly metallic, hummed with a nervous energy that mirrored his own. He checked his watch, the luminous hands glowing faintly in the gloom. Time was running out. He reached the service elevator, its steel doors scarred and dented, a stark contrast to the gilded cages of the gala. Inside, the stale air hung heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic whir of the machinery. The journey down felt interminable, each floor a descent into the underbelly of this glittering facade. He finally reached the designated floor, a labyrinth of storage rooms and utility closets. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He found the janitor's closet, the air thick with the smell of bleach and dust. He located the discarded champagne glass, carefully extracting the remaining residue with a sterile swab, his hands trembling slightly. The action felt clandestine, shameful, despite the righteousness of his intentions. The weight of his secret pressed down on him. He wasn't just questioning his father's actions. He was questioning his own identity, his place within this gilded cage he called a family. The act of collecting the sample felt like a betrayal, a transgression against the unquestioned loyalty he'd always felt. He pocketed the swab, the plastic a cold comfort against the turmoil in his gut. The silence of the corridor felt oppressive, the shadows deepening as if to swallow him whole. He pushed away the doubt, focusing on Ava. Her image, the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet dignity she maintained amidst the cruelty, fueled his resolve. He had to know. He had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The truth, he hoped, might offer them both a measure of redemption. Leaving the closet, Julian felt the heavy weight of his secret settle upon him once more, a burden he would soon have to share. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a stark contrast to the opulent ballroom. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and stale air. Julian's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each beat echoing the tremor in his hands as he held the swab. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, a violation of his loyalty, even as he knew he was doing the right thing. He reached his apartment, the quiet stark against the cacophony of the gala. He placed the swab in a prepaid envelope, the act feeling both monumental and insignificant. The simple act of sealing the envelope felt like sealing his own fate, his future hanging precariously in the balance. He sank onto the sofa, the plush velvet unexpectedly cold beneath his weight. His father's words echoed in his mind, the sneering contempt, the casual cruelty. He pictured Ava's face, the quiet dignity masking the hurt, the quiet strength that had captivated him. He glimpsed something in her eyes, a shared vulnerability, a resilience born of shared hardship he couldn't quite explain. Days stretched into a suffocating silence, broken only by the mundane rhythm of his life. The anticipation gnawed at him, a relentless hunger that left him exhausted and on edge. He paced his apartment, the silence amplifying the turmoil within him. He felt suffocated, trapped between his loyalty to his father and the burgeoning truth that threatened to shatter his world. Then the email arrived. One word, positive. The simple word detonated in his mind, shattering the fragile peace he had managed to maintain. The weight of the truth, the shattering implications, threatened to crush him. His world tilted on its axis, the carefully constructed foundation of his life crumbling around him. He felt a deep breath catch in his throat, the air suddenly thin and insufficient. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life was about to change forever. He had to tell Ava. He had to. The sterile white of the lab's email felt like a stark contrast to the opulent gold of the gala. Julian reread the single word, positive, a tremor running through him. The weight of it pressed down, a physical burden settling on his chest. He felt a suffocating dread, the air growing thin, his breath shallow. The quiet of his apartment was shattered, replaced by a roaring in his ears. He paced, the polished wood floor cold beneath his bare feet. The city lights, usually a comforting blur outside his window, were now sharp, intrusive. He thought of Ava's face, the subtle curve of her lip, the quiet strength he'd seen flicker in her eyes. He'd felt a kinship, a connection inexplicable yet undeniable. Now that connection had a name, half-sister. His phone felt heavy in his hand. He dialed Ava's number, the ring echoing the frantic rhythm of his heart. He imagined her answering, the surprise in her voice, the disbelief. He rehearsed what he would say, the words catching in his throat, each syllable laden with the immense weight of his revelation. Ava. His voice was a strained whisper, barely audible even to himself. A pause, a hesitant breath on the other end. Julian? Is something wrong? Her voice was soft, laced with concern. I need to see you, he managed, his voice trembling. It's important. Of course. When? Her voice held a note of apprehension, a subtle shift he couldn't miss. He hesitated, his mind racing. The safest place? His life upon. He pictured himself delivering the news, the stunned silence, the eruption of anger, maybe even disbelief. The possibility of her rejection, her disdain, gnawed at him. But more profoundly, the thought of her living another day unaware of her rightful place filled him with a profound sense of guilt. Justice, family, two forces locked in a desperate struggle within him, both demanding their due. The ticking clock on his desk seemed to mock him, each second a hammer blow to his already fragile resolve. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. The truth, like a wounded animal, needed to be set free. He picked up his phone, his finger hovering over Ava's number. This was it, the beginning of the end, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something new. His finger trembled, hovering over the call button. The muted chime of the antique grandfather clock in the hall punctuated the silence, each tick a tiny hammer blow against his resolve. He imagined Ava's apartment, the quiet elegance he'd glimpsed at the gala, now overlaid with a shadow of his father's cruelty. He pictured her, alone, perhaps still grappling with the humiliation, unaware of the seismic shift about to rock her world. He finally pressed the button. The ringing was sharp, insistent, a jarring intrusion into his carefully constructed calm. 3 rings. 4. His heart hammered against his ribs. Hello. Ava's voice, a low murmur, was laced with a weariness that pierced him. Julian cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. Ava? It's Julian, from the gala. He paused, the weight of the impending revelation pressing down on him. A brief silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of the phone line. He could almost hear her breath catch. Julian, she replied, her voice cautious. Is everything all right? He swallowed hard. I need to. I need to talk to you about something important. Something personal. He could feel the sweat prickling his skin. Of course, she said, her voice softer now, a hint of concern underlying her words. Is it about your father? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the plunge. Yes, it's about your father, and about me, about us. He felt a sudden wave of nausea. The truth, once unleashed, would consume them both. There's something you need to know, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. A DNA test. It revealed we're half-siblings. The words hung in the air, shattering the fragile peace of the evening. Silence, thick and suffocating, followed. Then, a shaky intake of breath from the other end. The weight of the revelation hung between them, a palpable thing. A shared burden suddenly laid bare. Ava's breath hitched. The antique phone felt slick in her hand, the cool Bakelite a stark contrast to the sudden heat rising in her chest. Julian's words hung in the air, heavy and improbable. A bizarre twist in a life already brimming with unexpected turns. Outside, the city hummed, a distant lullaby compared to the frantic rhythm of her own heart. The apartment, usually her sanctuary, felt suddenly claustrophobic. Half-siblings? She whispered, the words sounding alien, detached. The comfortable silence of her evening unraveled, replaced by a dizzying sense of unreality. She pictured Julian, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, the image overlaying the arrogant sneer of his father. The connection he'd felt at the gala, a flicker of something unspoken, something undeniably kindred, now took on a terrifying, heartbreaking clarity. Yes, Julian said, his voice barely a breath. The test? It was conclusive. He hesitated, the silence stretching, filled only with the distant sirens wailing a mournful counterpoint to the turmoil within them both. Ava could almost taste the bitter metallic tang of shock in her mouth. My God, she breathed, clutching the phone tighter. The opulent ballroom, the glittering chandeliers, the condescending gaze of Arthur. It all seemed to shift, refracted through this new, devastating lens. Her carefully constructed world, her hard-earned success, felt suddenly precarious, as if built on shifting sands. I didn't know how to tell you, Julian continued, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to prepare you, but I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I needed you to know. The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, a stark contrast to the controlled facade he'd presented at the gala. Tears stung Ava's eyes, blurring the already indistinct shapes in her apartment. The weight of the revelation pressed down, heavy and suffocating. She thought of her mother, a woman whose strength and resilience had been the cornerstone of Ava's own life, a woman who had always shielded her from the ugliness of the world. Had she known? Had she hidden this truth, protecting her daughter from the bitter legacy of Arthur's deceit? The questions hung unanswered, painful thorns in her heart. Ava began, her voice trembling, but the words caught in her throat. The silence stretched again, a fragile space holding the weight of their shared secret, the devastating truth of their unexpected connection. The city lights outside flickered, mirroring the uncertainty that consumed her. This new reality, this shocking revelation, demanded time, demanded reflection. But for now, all she could feel was the raw, visceral shock of it all. The unexpected bond, forged in the crucible of her father's cruelty, was a wound that would take time to heal. But even in this moment of upheaval, a flicker of something else ignited, a tentative spark of hope in the face of adversity. The phone lay heavy in Ava's hand, the Bakelite cold against her skin. Outside, the city throbbed with a life that felt distant, unreal compared to the turmoil inside her. Julian's voice, a fragile echo in her memory, repeated in her mind, half-siblings. The word felt like a brand, searing a new reality onto her soul. She sank onto the plush velvet sofa, the softness a stark contrast to the harshness of the revelation. The apartment, usually a haven, felt like a cage. The The scent of lavender from her aromatherapy diffuser, usually calming, now felt cloying, suffocating. She ran a hand through her hair, the smooth strands suddenly rough, tangled, mirroring the chaos in her thoughts. I need time, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. The image of Julian, his face etched with a mixture of fear and determination, flashed before her eyes. His hesitant words, his vulnerability, were a stark counterpoint to her father's callous cruelty. A wave of nausea rolled over her. The opulent gala, the glittering chandeliers, the sting of Arthur's scorn. It all swam before her, distorted by this new, horrifying truth. The carefully constructed life she'd built, the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve, felt fragile, as if suspended by a single strained thread. The silence stretched, a vast, echoing space filled only with the unspoken questions that clawed at her. Had her mother known? Had she carried this secret, this monumental betrayal, for years? The thought was a physical blow, a gut-wrenching pain that left her breathless. She picked up a framed photograph from the coffee table, her mother's smiling face staring back at her. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter, of love, but also of a hidden burden, a weight she'd silently shouldered. The photograph, once a source of comfort, now felt like an accusation, a silent testament to a life lived in the shadows of Arthur's lies. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a cool trail in its wake. The shock was giving way to a deep, gnawing grief. Grief for the lost years, for the truth withheld, for the fractured reality that lay before her. But beneath the grief, a tiny ember of defiance began to glow. This wasn't the end. This was a beginning, a new fight, a new struggle, but one she was determined to face. The fight for her heritage, for her identity, for the truth. The phone vibrated against Ava's silk pajamas, a jarring counterpoint to the quiet hum of the city outside her window. Hesitantly, she answered. Julian's voice, a low tremor, filled the room. Ava, it's about the test. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The scent of lilies from a nearby vase suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. Yes, Julian, she replied, her voice barely a whisper, a tremor echoing his own. A long pause stretched between them, a silent chasm filled only with the frantic beat of Ava's heart. Then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke. It came back positive. We're half-siblings. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed the city sounds. Ava stared out at the cityscape, the glittering lights blurring into a chaotic mess. The opulent gala, Arthur's cruel words, the sting of humiliation. It all coalesced into a nauseating wave. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Half-siblings, she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I'm so sorry, Ava. Julian's voice broke, the weight of the revelation evident. I didn't know how else to tell you. Ava found her voice, though it was shaky. My mother. Did she know? The question hung in the air, a desperate plea for understanding. A sharp pain pierced her chest, a physical manifestation of the betrayal. I don't know, Julian confessed, his voice laced with guilt. I haven't had time to process it all yet myself. He cleared his throat, the sound strained. But I found something, some old letters. They hinted at a relationship between my father and a woman named Eleanor. The name resonated with a distant familiarity, a faint echo from a past she barely remembered. A childhood photograph flickered in her mind. A young woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Her mother. The truth, as brutal as it was, began to bloom into agonizing clarity. The luxury of her apartment, the success of her career, all tainted by the bitter knowledge of her father's deceit. I need time, Ava finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, a crushing burden. But beneath the despair, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered. This wasn't just a revelation. It was the start of a A fight for justice, for her identity, for the truth. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. The conversation had ended, but a new chapter, born of pain and betrayal, had begun. Ava stared at the ceiling, the ornate plasterwork blurring through her unshed tears. The city's hum, usually a comforting lullaby, felt like a mocking chorus to the turmoil within her. Half-sister. The word echoed in the cavernous silence of her apartment, a monstrous truth clawing its way into her reality. The expensive silk sheets felt rough against her skin, a stark contrast to the opulent comfort she'd once taken for granted. Everything felt tainted, poisoned by Arthur's cruelty and the revelation of her own hidden lineage. She replayed Julian's words in her mind, each syllable a tiny hammer blow against her composure. Eleanor. The name, whispered like a secret, resonated with a fragile, almost forgotten memory. A faded photograph, a woman's kind eyes, her mother. The anger, fierce and hot, threatened to consume her. The years of striving, of being overlooked, of fighting for recognition in a world that deliberately ignored her, all fueled by a lie, a deliberate omission crafted by the man who was, unbelievably, her father. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled to the bathroom, the cool porcelain of the sink a welcome contrast to the burning heat in her cheeks. Looking at her reflection, she saw a stranger staring back. Eyes red-rimmed, face pale, the carefully constructed facade of composure shattered. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about a stolen identity, a life built on a foundation of lies. The phone rang again, jarring her from her self-pity. It was Julian. Ava? His voice was hesitant, laced with concern. Are you all right? No, she managed, her voice a raw whisper. I'm not all right. How could he? He's always been complicated, Julian said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. But the letters, they showed a different side, a side he desperately tried to hide. And you believed him all this time? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Julian sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. I tried to, but there was always something unsettling. His hatred for you, it was visceral, unjustified. It was like he was fighting against something he couldn't quite confront. Ava closed her eyes, picturing the gala, Arthur's sneering face, the casual cruelty of his words, the cold indifference of the other guests. She had felt the sting of his rejection, the weight of his prejudice. Now she understood the twisted source of that hate. It was a hatred born not of disdain, but of fear. Fear of exposure, of a past he'd worked so hard to bury. The city lights, a shimmering tapestry viewed from her penthouse apartment, offered no solace. Ava traced the rim of a half-empty glass of expensive wine, the crystal cold against her trembling fingers. Julian's words replayed like a broken record. Half-sister. The implications crashed around her, a tidal wave of disbelief and fury. The silk sheets, once a symbol of luxury, now felt like a suffocating shroud. Each breath was a struggle, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil raging within. The phone buzzed, the shrill ring slicing through the silence. It was Julian again. She hesitated, the urge to retreat into the comforting numbness of solitude battling with the need for answers, for support. She answered, her voice a fragile whisper. Ava? I wanted to see how you were holding up. Julian's voice was laced with genuine concern, a stark contrast to the clinical detachment of the legal proceedings looming ahead. Holding up? She echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I feel like I've been hit by a truck. This isn't about money, Julian. It's about everything. I know, he replied softly. I understand, but we have to face this. We have to face him. The mention of Arthur sparked a fresh wave of anger. The image of his sneering face, the callous cruelty in his eyes, flooded her memory. The casual disdain he displayed towards her at the gala, now illuminated by the monstrous truth of their relationship, was almost unbearable. How can I face him? She choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. He He treated me like I was nothing, and now I find out I'm his daughter." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city. Then, Julian's voice, quieter now, more resolute, filled the void. "We'll face him together. We'll show him the truth, Ava. We'll show him that his prejudice, his lies, won't win. We'll show him the strength of a woman he tried to erase." His words, though intended to comfort, only served to highlight the enormity of the battle ahead. The fight wasn't just for her inheritance. It was for her identity, for the recognition she'd been denied for so long. It was for her mother, whose name was a whisper, a ghost in a faded photograph, a silent testament to a life stolen by Arthur's deliberate cruelty. The fight was for her very soul. The weight of it nearly crushed her. But in Julian's quiet support, she found a flicker of hope, a fragile, but persistent, flame in the overwhelming darkness. The penthouse suite felt less like a sanctuary, more like a gilded cage. Ava stared out at the city, a million glittering lights mocking her inner turmoil. The champagne flute, still half full, felt heavy in her hand, the chilled liquid doing little to soothe the burning in her throat. Julian's words echoed half-sister, a jarring dissonance in the symphony of her life. She traced the delicate carvings on the crystal, the intricate details mirroring the intricate web of lies she was now entangled in. The phone vibrated again, the insistent buzz a physical manifestation of the anxiety gnawing at her. It was Julian. She hesitated, the prospect of another conversation feeling like scaling a sheer cliff face. But the silence was a suffocating blanket, and the fragile hope Julian offered was a lifeline she couldn't bear to sever. "Ava," his voice, soft and laced with concern, was a balm against the raw wound. "How are you, really?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. How was she? Betrayed, shattered, yet strangely empowered. The anger simmered beneath the surface, a volcano threatening to erupt. "I'm processing," she finally managed, her voice a low tremor. "It's surreal." "I know," Julian responded, his voice sympathetic. "But we have to be ready. My father, he won't go down without a fight." The image of Arthur's sneering face, his condescending words echoing in the opulent hall, flooded her memory. The casual cruelty, the blatant disregard for her humanity. It was a festering wound, now exposed and bleeding. He treated me like I was invisible," she whispered, the words laced with a bitterness that surprised even her. And now this. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant siren wail. The city, a symbol of glamour and success, felt cold and alien. Then Julian's voice, steadier now, more resolute, filled the void. "We'll face him together, Ava. We have the truth, and that's our weapon. He tried to erase you, but he can't erase what's in that DNA report. We'll show him what he did. We'll show him that his prejudice and power won't win." His words weren't a promise of easy victory, but a declaration of war. A war not just for an inheritance, but for recognition, for justice, for the life that Arthur had so callously attempted to deny her. The fight, she realized, was for her mother's memory, for the quiet dignity she'd always strived for the woman she was always meant to be. It was, in the end, a fight for her very soul. And in Julian's quiet strength, she found the courage to face it. The darkness remained, but now, a flickering flame of hope illuminated the way. The penthouse suite hummed with a low, unsettling thrum, the faint vibration of the city's pulse echoing the tremor in Ava's chest. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape, painted shifting patterns across the polished marble floor. Each shard of light felt like a spotlight, exposing the raw vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ash. The crystal flute felt cold against her trembling lips. She replayed Julian's words in her mind. Half-sister. The word, so simple, yet so devastatingly complex, shattered the carefully constructed edifice of her life. She was not just overlooked, not just insulted. She was erased. a ghost haunting the margins of a life she never knew. Tears welled, blurring the cityscape. "It's not just the money," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a confession more to herself than to the empty room. The silence, thick and heavy, pressed down on her. The weight of her mother's absence, a constant ache, now intensified, amplified by this shocking revelation. A soft knock echoed, breaking the suffocating silence. Julian. The relief was immediate, a fleeting warmth in the chilling reality of her new world. She composed herself, wiping her eyes, trying to regain some semblance of control. She needed to be strong. For herself, for her mother's memory, for the fight that lay ahead. He entered, his face etched with concern. He carried a file, the crisp edges a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling within them both. "I've gone over everything," he said quietly, his voice a soothing balm. "The legal aspects, the implications." Ava nodded, her throat tight. She picked up the champagne flute, the cold glass momentarily numbing her raw nerves. "It feels unreal," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "Like I'm watching someone else's life unfold." Julian sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. The simple gesture, a small act of comfort, was surprisingly powerful. "It is," he acknowledged, his voice soft but firm. "But it's your life now, Ava, and we'll navigate this together." His gaze held hers, offering not just support, but a silent promise of unwavering solidarity. The city lights continued their dazzling display outside, a testament to the vast gulf that separated their worlds. Yet, in this moment, their shared truth forged an unexpected connection. A fragile bridge built on a foundation of shared blood and a shared fight for justice. The war, as Julian had said, had begun. Julian's penthouse apartment, a sleek contrast to Ava's modest home, felt both intimidating and strangely comforting. The panoramic city view, usually a spectacle, was lost in the whirlwind of Ava's emotions. The scent of expensive coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that clung to her. She sat rigidly on the plush sofa, the soft leather a jarring counterpoint to the turmoil within. "It's a lot to take in," Ava finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. The carefully constructed facade of composure she'd maintained was crumbling, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. Julian watched her, his heart aching. He'd anticipated her disbelief, but the depth of her shock was still unsettling. He pushed a file across the low glass table, the smooth surface a cold comfort. "The lawyers are already preparing the initial paperwork. They've advised us to remain discreet for now." Ava picked up the file, the weight of it mirroring the weight of the revelation. Her fingers traced the crisp edges, her mind racing. This wasn't just about money. It was about her entire life, rewritten in a stroke of devastating, unexpected truth. The anger, the hurt, the years of feeling unseen. They all surged forward, threatening to overwhelm her. "Discreet?" she echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "My father publicly humiliated me, told me I didn't belong. How much more discreet can it get?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. The champagne, Julian's thoughtful gesture, sat untouched. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The contact, unexpected, grounded her amidst the chaos. "I know," he said softly, his voice filled with empathy. "But this is about strategy. We need to be prepared for his reaction. He won't take this lying down." Ava nodded, her breath catching in her throat. The image of Arthur's sneering face flashed before her eyes, igniting a fresh wave of anger. The injustice, the years of subtle and overt racism she'd endured, fueled a fierce determination. This wasn't just about financial gain. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her identity. The fight, as Julian had said, had begun. The quiet strength in his eyes, mirrored in her own resolve, promised a battle fought together, a shared truth against a formidable foe. The city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to their turmoil, a silent witness to their shared secret and the war that lay ahead. Julian's words hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the luxurious silence of his penthouse. Ava, still reeling from the revelation, felt the plush sofa dig into her thighs, a physical manifestation of her internal turmoil. The city shimmered below, a breathtaking panorama utterly lost on her. Each glittering light seemed a mocking reminder of the chasm between her past and her suddenly altered future. "He won't just accept this," she finally said, her voice barely a breath. The metallic taste of fear coated her tongue. She picked up the coffee cup, the warmth a feeble comfort against the icy dread creeping into her bones. The rich aroma, usually enticing, now felt cloying. Julian watched her struggle, his own unease mirroring hers. The weight of his actions, the potential fallout for his family, pressed down on him. He'd anticipated her shock, but witnessing its raw, visceral impact was different. He reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, yet firm. "No," he agreed, his voice low. "He won't, but we'll be ready. I've already spoken to Ms. Davies. She's the best. She'll handle everything." The mention of lawyers brought a fresh wave of anger. The image of Arthur's sneering face, the casual cruelty of his words, burned behind her eyelids. "Ready?" she echoed, her voice rising. Prepared for what? Another public humiliation? Another blatant display of his power? Tears threatened, but she blinked them back, focusing on the burning anger that fueled her. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sirens. The luxurious apartment felt like a cage, the opulent furnishings mocking the stark reality of her situation. This wasn't just about money. It was about years of accumulated resentment, of injustices suffered in silent dignity. "This isn't just about the inheritance, Julian," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "It's about justice. It's about making him accountable." Her eyes met his, fierce and unwavering. The initial disbelief had given way to a steely resolve. This fight, she realized, was far from over. It was just beginning, and she was ready. Julian squeezed Ava's hand, the warmth a small comfort against the chilling reality of their situation. The penthouse, a monument to his father's wealth, felt suffocating. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the storm brewing within them. Outside, the city hummed a discordant symphony, a stark contrast to the tense silence in the room. "I know it's terrifying," Julian said softly, his voice a balm against the rising tide of Ava's fear. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way her breath hitched. "But you're not alone. I'm here." Ava nodded, her throat tight. The weight of the revelation, the sheer audacity of it all, threatened to crush her. Years of striving, of being overlooked, of enduring subtle and blatant racism. All of it had culminated in this shattering truth. The inheritance was secondary. The recognition, the validation, the sheer justice of it, that was paramount. "He'll fight it," she whispered, her voice raspy. The image of Arthur's sneering face, the casual cruelty etched onto his features, flashed before her eyes. The taste of bitterness lingered on her tongue. "He'll use every dirty trick in the book. He'll use his money, his influence." "I know," Julian said, his gaze unwavering. "But we have Ms. Davies. She's prepared for this. We've anticipated his reaction. We have the DNA, irrefutable proof." He paused, searching her eyes for reassurance he wasn't sure he possessed. "We have the truth on our side." Ava looked out at the cityscape, the glittering lights blurred by unshed tears. The city that had once felt so distant, so unattainable, now seemed to press in on her, a suffocating weight of expectation and fear. "The truth?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's a weapon, isn't it? One he'll try to destroy before it can harm him." She finally met Julian's gaze, her own eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. "And I won't let him." The tremor in her voice had disappeared, replaced by a steely determination that mirrored the strength Julian had sensed within her all along. This fight, she knew, would be brutal, but she was ready. Julian's penthouse apartment, a breathtaking panorama of the city, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a pressure cooker. The air hung thick with unspoken anxieties, the scent of expensive coffee unable to mask the underlying tension. Ava, perched on a plush velvet sofa, traced the intricate pattern with a trembling finger. The silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city, stretched taut, a fragile membrane about to burst. "He won't accept it," Ava finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's muted roar. Her eyes, usually bright and sharp, were clouded with a weariness that went beyond simple exhaustion. It was the weariness of a lifetime spent battling prejudice, a lifetime spent proving her worth. Julian, watching her, felt a familiar pang of guilt. He'd thrust this burden upon her, this earth-shattering revelation, and now he was helplessly witnessing its impact. He rose, pouring her a glass of water, his movements tentative, seeking to offer comfort without intruding. "I know," he said softly, handing her the glass, "but we have to be prepared. Ms. Davies, our lawyer, has anticipated every possible countermove. She's meticulously documented everything, every slight, every instance of his prejudice." Ava took a slow sip, the water doing little to quench the burning dryness in her throat. The taste of betrayal, of years of subtle slights and overt insults, still lingered. "It's not just the money, Julian," she said, her voice stronger now, laced with a newfound steel. "It's about the principle. It's about the years of being overlooked, of being treated as if I didn't belong. He tried to erase me, to deny my very existence. He can't get away with it." The city lights twinkled outside, mirroring the growing determination in her eyes. A small smile played on her lips, a flicker of defiance against the storm that raged within her. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about reclaiming her identity, her dignity, her rightful place in the world. This was a battle she was ready to fight, and she wouldn't be fighting alone. The warmth of Julian's presence, the shared understanding in his eyes, offered her a comfort she hadn't expected, a powerful ally in a battle she never thought she'd face. The fight had begun. The mahogany doors of Arthur's sprawling estate swung open, revealing a cavernous hallway bathed in the cold light of a late afternoon sun. The air hung heavy with the scent of old money and simmering resentment. Ava, her hand trembling slightly, adjusted the crisp lines of her tailored suit. Julian walked beside her, his hand briefly brushing hers, a silent gesture of support. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of their heels on the polished floor. "Ready?" Julian asked, his voice a low murmur against the oppressive quiet. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, held a deep concern. Ava swallowed, the lump in her throat a physical manifestation of her fear. "As I'll ever be," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel the weight of the past, the years of subtle slights and blatant insults, pressing down on her. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her right to exist without being constantly belittled. The grand living room, usually a showcase of opulent excess, felt suffocating. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, sat rigidly in a leather armchair. His eyes, narrowed and cold, fixed on Ava with undisguised hostility. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, a silent battle brewing between father and daughter, a battle fought not with words but with years of ingrained prejudice and simmering resentment. "This is absurd," Arthur boomed, his voice echoing through the room, shattering the fragile tension. "A ridiculous charade, concocted by a desperate woman and a disloyal son." His words were sharp, laced with venom. He gestured dismissively towards the DNA report lying on the ornate coffee table, its stark white pages a stark contrast to the dark richness of the room. Ava stepped forward, her posture straight, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's not a charade, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected strength. "It's the truth, and the truth is, you've spent your life hiding from it." She saw a flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, in his eyes, a brief crack in the facade of arrogant indifference, fueled her resolve. The confrontation escalated, a maelstrom of denial, anger, and long-suppressed truths. Arthur's carefully constructed world began to crumble, the foundation of his self-deception cracking under the weight of Ava's unwavering gaze and the irrefutable evidence before him. The fight had truly begun, a battle for more than just an inheritance, but for recognition, for justice, for the right to simply be. The air hung thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations. Arthur's study, usually a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, felt like a pressure cooker. Ava, perched on the edge of a plush velvet chair, felt the fabric dig into her thighs, a physical manifestation of her anxiety. Julian paced, his movements restless, a stark contrast to Ava's rigid stillness. Sunlight, filtering through the heavy drapes, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the silent air. "He won't believe it," Julian muttered, running a hand through his hair. His voice, usually brimming with confidence, held a tremor of uncertainty. He glanced at Ava, his gaze searching, seeking reassurance he couldn't offer himself. Ava met his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "He will. He has to." The words, though firm, felt brittle, fragile even, against the weight of Arthur's anticipated fury. The DNA report, lying innocently on the polished desk, seemed to hum with unspoken power. A sudden, sharp rapping at the door shattered the tense quiet. Arthur entered, his face a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with barely contained rage. The scent of his expensive cologne couldn't mask the underlying bitterness. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over Ava, lingering on her clothing, her posture, everything that challenged his carefully constructed world. "Well?" he barked, the sound echoing the tremor of fear Julian tried to mask. His voice, usually smooth and commanding, was now raw with barely controlled fury. He gestured towards the report with a dismissive flick of his wrist. This is a joke, isn't it? Some pathetic attempt to extort me?" Ava swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The carefully constructed composure she had worked so hard to maintain threatened to crumble. "It's not a joke, Arthur," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, a testament to the unexpected strength she found within herself. "It's the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken truths and simmering resentment. The battle had begun. The fight for recognition, for justice, for her very right to exist was truly underway. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic beating of Ava's heart. The room, once opulent and suffocating, now felt pregnant with the potential for explosive confrontation. The mahogany desk, gleaming under the harsh glare of the overhead light, seemed to amplify Arthur's rage. His face, usually carefully sculpted by expensive skincare, was contorted with fury, veins throbbing in his temples. The scent of his cologne, usually a sophisticated blend of citrus and spice, now smelled acrid, like burning ambition. He slammed a hand on the desk, the sharp crack echoing the shattering of his carefully constructed world. "Lies!" he roared, his voice a guttural rasp. "All lies. She's nothing but a gold digger, trying to weasel her way into my fortune." His eyes, usually cold and calculating, blazed with a frightening intensity. He glared at Ava, his gaze stripping her bare, searching for a chink in her armor. Ava, her breath catching in her throat, met his gaze unflinchingly. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a newfound strength, a fierce determination fueled by years of quiet resilience. The velvet of the chair, once a symbol of her discomfort, now felt like a throne. "It's not about money, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her hands. The words, though soft, carried the weight of a lifetime's struggle. "It's about truth, about acknowledging the past." Julian, watching the silent battle unfold, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He saw the pain etched on Ava's face, the quiet dignity she fought to maintain. He saw the raw, unmasked rage in his father's eyes, a rage that went beyond simple denial. It was the desperate struggle of a man confronted with the ruins of his carefully constructed life. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the only sound the frantic drumming of Julian's heart. He opened his mouth to speak, to intervene, but Arthur cut him off. "Don't you dare," Arthur spat, his gaze turning icy on his son. "This is between me and her." He gestured towards Ava with a trembling hand, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This changes everything, everything I've built." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his self-deception and the crumbling foundation of his carefully crafted life. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with years of simmering resentment finally boiling over. The confrontation had begun, and the future of their family hung precariously in the balance. A fragile thing caught in the crossfire of truth and denial. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, felt suffocating. The scent of Arthur's expensive cigars, usually comforting, now hung heavy, acrid in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. Ava's silk dress, once a symbol of her aspiration, now felt like a cage. Arthur's words, raw and venomous, clawed at her composure. His denial wasn't just a rejection of the DNA. It was a repudiation of her very existence. "Gold digger," he spat, the word a venomous dart. "That's all you are. Using this fabrication to leech off my success." His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with a feverish intensity. He paced, the polished floorboards gleaming beneath his agitated steps. Ava's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "This isn't about money, Arthur," she said, her voice low, resonating with quiet strength. "It's about family, about a truth you've spent a lifetime burying. The years of silent resentment, the subtle indignities, the casual cruelty, all coalesced into a single, unwavering resolve." Julian watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw the pain etched on Ava's face, a quiet defiance masking a deep wound. He saw the desperation in his father's eyes, a mask of rage barely concealing the terror of his carefully constructed world crumbling. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against Arthur's carefully built facade. "You're delusional," Arthur roared, his voice cracking. This test, it's flawed. A mistake. A conspiracy." He slammed his fist on the desk, the papers jumping, a stark visual representation of his crumbling control. The expensive crystal decanter on the corner trembled, reflecting the turmoil in his eyes. He looked utterly broken, the carefully crafted veneer of success shattered, revealing the raw, wounded man beneath. Ava, despite the tremor in her hands, took a deep breath. "This isn't about you, Arthur. This is about me, about acknowledging the past and accepting the consequences of your actions." Her gaze met his, unwavering, conveying the quiet dignity that years of battling injustice had forged. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, a palpable entity pressing down on them all. The confrontation had only just begun, but the battle lines had been drawn, etched in the silence and the raw emotion that hung heavy in the room. The fight for truth and for justice was far from over. The courtroom was a glacial expanse of polished wood and hushed whispers. Sunlight, fractured by the tall, arched windows, cast long shadows across the mahogany benches. Ava sat ramrod straight, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the nervous fidgeting of Arthur's high-powered legal team. Their whispers, like venomous snakes, slithered across the tense silence. The air itself crackled with anticipation, a tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, sat rigidly beside his lawyers, his usually impeccably groomed hair slightly disheveled. He avoided eye contact with Ava, his gaze flitting nervously around the room. The once invincible Arthur, the man who had commanded respect with a mere glance, now seemed diminished, his power visibly waning. Julian, seated in the spectator gallery, felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The weight of his father's denial, the crushing burden of the family secret, pressed heavily on his chest. He watched Ava, her composure a testament to her strength, a strength he hadn't known she possessed. A flicker of admiration, laced with guilt, warmed his heart. "Ms. Du Bois," the sharp voice of Arthur's lead lawyer cut through the silence. The lawyer, a woman whose expensive suit couldn't quite mask her thinly veiled contempt for Ava, approached the stand. Her voice was smooth, oiled, yet dripping with disdain. "You claim this DNA test proves your relationship to Mr. Arthur Sterling. Are you aware of the potential ramifications of such a claim?" Ava's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Yes," she replied, her voice clear and strong, every word carrying the weight of her years of silent struggle. "I am fully aware." She paused, her eyes flicking towards Arthur, a hint of sadness softening the hard edge of her resolve. "I am also aware of the decades of injustice I've endured because of his prejudice." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of the courtroom clock, each tick a relentless reminder of time lost, of justice delayed. The weight of Arthur's denial, of his attempt to silence her, hung heavy in the air. The battle had begun, not just for an inheritance, but for recognition, for validation, for a place in a world that had long denied her one. The fight for her truth had become a fight for her soul. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old wood and expensive perfume, felt suffocating. Ava, perched on the witness stand, felt the weight of Arthur's gaze a cold, accusatory stare that hadn't softened even in the face of the damning DNA evidence. His denial, a fortress built on years of ingrained prejudice, seemed impenetrable. She could almost taste the bitterness of his resentment, a sharp, metallic tang on her tongue. "Ms. Du Bois," the lawyer's voice, a polished weapon, sliced through the silence. "Are you prepared to face the consequences of this audacious claim?" The word audacious hung in the air, dripping with contempt. Ava met the lawyer's gaze, her own eyes unwavering. The fear was there, a tremor deep in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a righteous anger, a fire that had been smoldering for years, finally ignited. "I am," she said, her voice low but firm, each syllable a carefully placed brick in the wall of her defense. The faint scent of lilies from the small vase on the judge's bench did little to calm the tempest inside her. The lawyer pressed on, her questions sharp, designed to undermine Ava's credibility, to paint her as a gold digger, a social climber. Each question felt like a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to strip her of her dignity. Julian, watching from the gallery, felt his fists clench. The lawyer's words were like blows aimed at Ava, and by extension at him, at his own fractured family. He saw a flash of pain in Ava's eyes, a fleeting vulnerability that was quickly masked by a steely resolve. He admired her strength, her quiet resilience in the face of such blatant hostility. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to amplify the silence between each question and answer. The sunlight, filtering through the tall windows, painted stripes of light and shadow across the polished floor, highlighting the stark contrast between the sterile elegance of the courtroom and the raw, emotional battle unfolding within its walls. Ava's composure, though outwardly strong, was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. Yet, with every carefully chosen word, she built her case, not just for a legal victory, but for a life finally lived on her own terms. Lawyer's voice dripped with insinuation. Ava looked at Julian, his face pale with concern. His eyes, filled with unwavering support, gave her strength. "My connection to Julian is deeper than any financial interest," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "It's a connection of blood, of shared heritage, of finally understanding a past that had been kept hidden from me for so long." The lawyer's smile faltered. The carefully crafted narrative began to unravel. Ava's simple words, backed by the unshakable conviction in her eyes, struck a chord with the jury. The weight of the legal battle began to shift, the scales of justice tilting ever so slightly in Ava's favor. The courtroom, tense moments before, now felt charged with a renewed sense of hope. The afternoon light seemed brighter, casting a hopeful glow upon the determined faces of Ava and Julian. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt within reach. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and nervous energy. Sunlight, fractured by the tall Gothic windows, dappled the polished floor. Ava felt Julian's hand, a comforting weight in hers, a silent promise of shared strength. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his gaze darting between Ava and the judge. The lawyer, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, continued her relentless cross-examination. "Ms. Dubois," she began, her voice a smooth, sharp blade. "You claim Mr. Hayes, your alleged half-brother, surreptitiously obtained a DNA sample, yet you offer no corroborating evidence. This is a serious accusation, wouldn't you agree?" Ava swallowed, the dryness in her throat mirroring the tension in the room. It was a private act, a desperate attempt to uncover the truth he and his father tried so hard to bury. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes held firm. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Julian squeezed her hand again, a silent affirmation of his belief. The lawyer pressed on, her questions designed to undermine Ava's credibility, to paint her as a vengeful opportunist. Each question was a blow, each answer a carefully chosen defense. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. Ava could feel the weight of Arthur's silent fury, the cold animosity emanating from him like a chilling breeze. He looked older, the carefully crafted mask of wealth and power cracking under the strain. His carefully constructed facade of invincibility crumbled with every question, revealing the frightened, desperate man beneath. Ava saw a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes, not fear of losing his money, but of losing the carefully constructed narrative of his life. A sudden recess was called. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the underlying current of conflict remained. As Ava and Julian stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the courtroom faded, replaced by the hushed murmurs and hurried footsteps of those involved in the case. Julian's hand remained clasped in hers, a tangible link between their shared journey. "It's getting harder," he whispered, his voice strained. Ava nodded, her own exhaustion palpable. The weight of the legal battle, the emotional toll, was immense. But in Julian's unwavering support, she found the strength to carry on, to fight for the truth, to fight for herself. The fight wasn't just for the inheritance. It was a fight for justice, for recognition, for a past reclaimed. The next phase of the trial loomed, heavy with uncertainty, yet in the quiet strength of their shared bond, a quiet hope bloomed. The fluorescent lights of the hallway hummed, a counterpoint to the pounding in Julian's chest. He squeezed Ava's hand again, the rough texture of her tailored suit a grounding presence against the swirling uncertainty. "My father," he began, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the sterile quiet of the corridor. He saw the exhaustion etched onto Ava's face, the dark circles under her eyes mirroring his own. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. Ava leaned against the cool wall, the smooth surface a welcome contrast to the relentless pressure in the courtroom. "He's crumbling," she observed, her voice low but steady. "The mask's slipping." She looked at Julian, her gaze searching, filled with a mixture of concern and quiet understanding. The fear in his eyes. It wasn't about the money, was it? Julian shook his head, his eyes distant. No, it was about the lie, about the life he built on a foundation of deceit. The truth. It's like a tidal wave, eroding everything he thought he'd secured. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the stress gnawing at him. The weight of his father's unraveling, the fracture of their relationship, was visible in the slump of his shoulders. He felt a pang of guilt, a familiar ache of loyalty warring with the burgeoning moral compass he'd discovered within himself. A sudden rush of lawyers and court officials swept past them, their hushed conversations a chaotic wave. The hallway, momentarily cleared, allowed a fragile silence to settle. Ava inhaled deeply, steeling herself. The recess had given them a brief reprieve, but the looming battle still held the potential to shatter them both. "We'll face it together," Ava said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Her gaze met Julian's, a silent promise exchanged between them, a bond forged not just by shared blood, but by a shared struggle against injustice. The scent of impending confrontation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Yet in the quiet strength of their shared gaze, a stubborn hope flickered. The fight continued. The courtroom's air, thick with tension and the scent of old wood and expensive perfume, pressed down on them. Ava felt Julian's hand tighten in hers, a silent reassurance against the onslaught of Arthur's lawyers. Their cross-examination was a brutal dance, twisting Ava's words, attempting to portray her as a gold digger, a social climber. The judge, a stoic figure behind his imposing bench, seemed impervious to the emotional turmoil swirling in the room. Ava felt a cold dread creep into her bones, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth of Julian's hand. "Ms. Dubois?" A sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "Your relationship with Mr. Julian Arthur, is it purely coincidental that this connection surfaced only after the initial accusation?" The lawyer's eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity. Ava felt a surge of anger, hot and quick. She glanced at Julian, his face pale, his jaw tight. He squeezed her hand again, a silent promise of support. "It is not coincidental," Ava said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Our connection is rooted in a truth that Mr. Arthur has spent his life trying to bury, a truth that transcends social standing and wealth." Her voice gained strength, fueled by righteous anger. "It is a truth that exposes his hypocrisy, his prejudice, and the lies he's built his empire upon." Julian watched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the raw emotion in Ava's eyes, the steel in her spine, and a fierce pride bloomed in his chest. His father, watching from the defendant's table, was a picture of controlled fury, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. The lawyer pressed on, his questions becoming more aggressive, his attempts to discredit Ava more blatant. But with each barbed question, Ava's resolve hardened. She answered with calm precision, each word a carefully placed brick in a wall of resistance. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing breathing in the hushed whispers and strained silences. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second an agonizing measure of the battle's intensity. The weight of the situation, the pressure of the legal machinery, the emotional toll, it all hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket of anxiety. Yet, in that suffocating atmosphere, a quiet strength bloomed between Ava and Julian, a bond forged in the crucible of injustice. Their shared gaze, a silent communication across the courtroom, held a promise of resilience, of truth, and of a future built not on deceit, but on a foundation of honesty and justice. The courtroom's hushed atmosphere felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the high windows, illuminating the tense faces of the spectators. Ava felt Julian's hand, a comforting weight in hers, his knuckles bone-white. His silent support was a lifeline in this turbulent sea of legal maneuvering. Arthur, his face a mask of simmering fury, watched from the defendant's table, his eyes cold and accusing. "Ms. Dubois," the lawyer's voice, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the silence. "Your claim, it's convenient, wouldn't you say? This sudden familial connection arising only after the public humiliation." Ava's throat tightened. The lawyer's words, designed to wound, stung. She swallowed, the dry lump catching painfully. She met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "Convenient? My connection with Julian is the inconvenient truth your client has spent a lifetime burying," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. The courtroom held its breath. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. Julian's grip on her hand tightened. He felt the tremor in her fingers, the vulnerability beneath her brave facade. He squeezed back, a silent message of strength and unwavering support. He saw the battle raging within her, the fight for justice, for recognition, for her very identity. It mirrored his own internal struggle, the clash between his loyalty to his father and his burgeoning sense of morality. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that their father's carefully constructed life was about to crumble. The judge, a stoic figure observing the drama unfold, tapped a pen against his desk, a sharp staccato sound in the otherwise tense silence. The tension in the room was a palpable entity, thick and suffocating, a suffocating blanket of anticipation. Ava felt a wave of nausea, but she stood firm, her gaze locked with the lawyer's, her determination hardening with each passing moment. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, surrounded by the weight of expectation, Ava and Julian found strength in each other. A shared strength forged in the crucible of injustice, a bond that promised to endure. The future was uncertain, but their shared determination burned brightly, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. The weight of the courtroom pressed down on Julian. The air, thick with the scent of old wood and simmering tension, felt heavy in his lungs. He watched his father, Arthur, his usually impeccable composure fractured, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Each sharp intake of breath, each subtle twitch of a hand, spoke volumes of the man's inner turmoil. He was unraveling, thread by thread, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. Julian felt a pang of sympathy, a flicker of the filial loyalty that had once been unshakable. But it was quickly eclipsed by a deeper, more profound emotion: disappointment. The man he'd revered, the man he'd looked up to all his life, was revealed to be a man fueled by prejudice and deceit. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. He stole a glance at Ava. Her face, usually alight with intelligence and warmth, was etched with a weariness that went beyond the stresses of the trial. She sat ramrod straight, her gaze unwavering, but Julian saw the tremor in her hand, the slight clenching of her jaw. The burden of this fight, of exposing a deeply ingrained societal injustice, was taking its toll. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom as the opposing lawyer delivered his scathing cross-examination. Julian felt Ava's hand tighten in his, a silent plea for strength, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. He returned the pressure, a silent vow of unwavering support. Their bond, forged in the fire of a shared secret and a mutual fight for justice, felt stronger than ever. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. The heat and tension could be cut with a knife. The air was thick with the scent of fear, resentment, and the desperate clinging to power. He knew, in the depths of his soul, that this fight wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about justice, redemption, and the shattering of a carefully constructed lie. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were in this together. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered anxieties and hushed pronouncements. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany. Julian felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, the pressure of physical entity pressing down on his chest. He watched Ava, her composure a fragile mask barely concealing the exhaustion etched on her face. Her usually bright eyes held a haunted look, reflecting the relentless glare of the legal battle. "It's a lot," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible above the courtroom's low hum. Her hand, resting briefly on his, was icy cold. Julian squeezed her hand gently. "I know, but we're almost there." His own voice trembled slightly, betraying the carefully constructed facade of strength he'd maintained. He didn't want her to see his fear, his doubts. He needed to be strong for her, for both of them. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that sliced through the tense silence. The opposing lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Mr. Sterling, launched into his closing argument, his words laced with venom, twisting facts to paint Arthur as a victim of a malicious scheme. Julian felt a surge of anger, a hot, bitter taste rising in his throat. He saw Ava flinch at Sterling's particularly cruel insinuations, the calculated barbs designed to undermine her character and credibility. The subtle shift in her posture, the way her jaw tightened, revealed the depth of her pain. It fueled a burning resolve within Julian. He wouldn't let this man, this system, tear them down. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, a living thing breathing in the confined space. Each tick of the grandfather clock on the wall echoed the relentless march of time, each second bringing them closer to the verdict. Ava's quiet strength, her unwavering gaze, inspired him. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for every overlooked individual silenced by prejudice. This fight was becoming bigger than their family secret, bigger than inheritance. It was about justice, about truth, about challenging a system rigged against the voiceless. And Julian, hand clasped in Ava's, felt a profound sense of purpose, a quiet strength born of shared struggle and a bond forged in the crucible of adversity. The weight of the world felt lighter, replaced by a steely determination. They would prevail. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing in the suffocating silence. Mr. Sterling, a predator in a tailored suit, continued his venomous closing argument, his words slithering like vipers. Ava's hand, still clasped in Julian's, trembled. The cool marble of the courtroom floor seemed to seep the chill into her very bones. She met Julian's gaze, a silent plea passing between them, a shared understanding of the immense pressure. His thumb rubbed hers, a small gesture of comfort in the storm. Outside the courtroom, the city throbbed, a relentless pulse of life oblivious to the drama unfolding within. But inside, time seemed to slow, each second stretched taut, each breath heavy with anticipation. Julian felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He'd seen his father crumble under the weight of the accusations, the carefully constructed facade of success cracking under the strain of truth. The Arthur he knew, the man who'd once seemed invincible, was now a broken shell, his eyes haunted by a lifetime of buried secrets and carefully nurtured prejudices. "He's breaking," Ava whispered, her voice barely a breath. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and warmth, were clouded with a deep sadness. Julian felt a pang of sympathy for his father, a fleeting moment of pity before the steel of determination hardened his resolve. He squeezed her hand again, his grip firm. "We'll get through this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant to reassure them both. The scent of old wood and polished brass filled the air, mingling with the faint perfume Ava always wore, a comforting constant in this maelstrom of uncertainty. The grandfather clock chimed, each chime a hammer blow against the silence, each toll a countdown to a verdict that would alter their lives irrevocably. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. Julian could taste it, a metallic tang on his tongue, a reflection of the bitter battle being waged. He felt Ava's slight flinch as Mr. Sterling launched into another vicious attack, his words painting her as a gold digger, a liar. The injustice of it choked him. This wasn't about money. This was about truth, about righting a decades-old wrong. He saw a flicker of defiant fire in Ava's eyes, a spark of resolve that mirrored his own. They were in this together, bound by more than just shared DNA. They were bound by a shared struggle against the insidious forces of prejudice and societal injustice. The weight of the world felt heavy, but so did the weight of their shared purpose. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom's hushed expectancy was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket woven from fear and anticipation. Ava, her hands still nestled in Julian's, felt the tremor in her own fingers mirroring the frantic rhythm of her heart. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat, crackled with unspoken tension. Julian squeezed her hand, a silent promise of unwavering support. He saw the strain etched on her face, the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. The relentless legal battle had chipped away at her usual radiance, leaving behind a quiet strength that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "They're trying to break us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of conversation. Julian nodded, his gaze unwavering. "They won't. We have the truth." His voice was firm, though a tremor of anxiety ran beneath the surface. He watched as his father, usually so composed, shifted restlessly in his chair, his face pale and drawn. The weight of his lies, His years of carefully constructed deceit were finally catching up to him. The judge's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the tension. Order! The hushed murmur subsided, replaced by an expectant silence. The judge's words, though initially unclear, slowly revealed the pivotal moment, a turning point in their lives. The subsequent moments were a blur. The lawyer's words, the judge's pronouncements, the shocked gasps from the gallery. It all melded into a cacophony of sound that Ava could barely process. Julian's hand remained a lifeline, anchoring her in the storm. Then a clarity emerged, a slow, dawning realization. They had won. The courtroom buzzed with relieved whispers. Ava felt Julian's hand tighten in hers, a silent affirmation of their shared victory. The weight of the last few months, the relentless pressure, the constant fear, it all seemed to drain away, leaving behind a fragile, hopeful calm. The judge's gavel echoed, a final punctuation to the chaotic symphony of the trial. Outside, the flash of cameras momentarily blinded Ava, the cacophony of reporters' questions a stark contrast to the quiet triumph she felt within. "It's over," Julian breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, truly saw her, the exhaustion etched onto her face, the resilience shining in her eyes. "We did it, Ava." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of vindication, of a justice long denied. The scent of rain, fresh and clean, washed over her as she stepped out into the humid afternoon air. The city's clamor a muted background hum. I still can't believe it," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The harsh glare of the sun felt strangely comforting, a tangible reminder of the world outside the courtroom's suffocating atmosphere. Julian pulled her close, a brotherly embrace that held the unspoken weight of their shared journey. "I know, but we did. And now," he paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow, "now we rebuild." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "We build something better." The hope in his voice was infectious, a beacon in the aftermath of the storm. Ava smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that promised a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream. The fight was won, but the true battle rebuilding her life, claiming her rightful place, was just beginning. The taste of victory was bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge that the fight for equality was far from over. Yet, in Julian's hand clasped in hers, in the fresh scent of rain, she found the strength to carry on. The courtroom's hushed silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock, each second amplifying the tension. The verdict, when it came, hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid summer air outside. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." The judge's voice, though clear, felt distant, unreal. Ava felt a tremor run through her, a wave of disbelief washing over her as the reality of the decision sunk in. Julian squeezed her hand, his knuckles white. Arthur, his face a mask of furious disbelief, remained motionless, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The victory felt hollow, tinged with the bitter taste of the fight it took to achieve it. The gallery erupted. A cacophony of whispers, gasps, and murmurs filled the room. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of Julian's apartment, the champagne felt flat. The celebratory mood felt forced. Ava stared out the rain-streaked window, the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. "Half of everything," she whispered, the words barely audible. The magnitude of her newfound wealth felt overwhelming, a stark contrast to the simple life she had meticulously built. "It's a lot," she admitted, her voice laced with uncertainty. Julian nodded, understanding etched on his face. "It's more than money, Ava. It's about justice, about acknowledging the wrongs that were done." His gaze held hers, conveying a silent promise of support. He understood the weight of her victory, the bittersweet nature of it all. The fight was won, but the scars remained. Their shared journey had forged a bond stronger than either could have anticipated. In the shared silence, a new chapter was silently unfolding. One of rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually. as they both navigated this unexpected inheritance and its lasting impact. The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the past, leaving behind the promise of a new beginning, tinged with hope and tinged with uncertainty. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of relieved whispers and hushed congratulations. Ava, however, felt numb. The victory felt distant, a hollow echo in the cavernous space. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished wood floor, but Ava saw only muted grays. Julian's hand, warm and reassuring in hers, was the only tangible comfort. "It's over," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, were shadowed with exhaustion. The weight of the battle, the burden of his secret, the fractured relationship with his father, it all showed in the lines etched around his eyes. Ava managed a weak smile. "Yes," she breathed, the word catching in her throat. The champagne they'd been offered tasted like ash. The opulent setting, a stark contrast to the simple elegance of her life, felt suffocating. Later, at a quiet bistro tucked away from the city's clamor, the reality of the verdict began to sink in. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee was a comfort in the otherwise sterile atmosphere. Ava traced the rim of her cup, her gaze lost in the swirling steam. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely a murmur. "Half of everything. It's more than I ever imagined." Julian reached across the small table, his touch gentle. "It's yours, Ava. You deserve it. It's not just about the money. It's about reclaiming your dignity, your voice." She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time since the trial began. His quiet strength, his unwavering support, had been her anchor throughout the storm. A bond, forged in the crucible of shared secrets and hard-fought battles, now shone stronger than any inheritance. A genuine smile finally broke through. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice laced with gratitude. "For everything." The rain outside had stopped. A sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the city. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ava felt a glimmer of hope. The fight was over. A new chapter, full of possibilities and challenges, had begun, and she wouldn't face it alone. The courtroom's hushed silence finally shattered, replaced by a cacophony of sound. The judge's gavel, a final, resounding thud, echoed the weight of the verdict. Ava felt Julian's hand tighten in hers, a silent reassurance amidst the swirling emotions. The victory felt less like triumph and more like a profound exhaustion. The scent of old wood and polished brass, usually opulent, now felt heavy, suffocating. She saw the relief flood Julian's face, but his eyes held a weary sadness. The weight of his actions, the betrayal of his father, still burdened him. Later, in the quiet solitude of Julian's penthouse apartment, overlooking the city's glittering lights, the reality of the win began to settle. A half-empty glass of champagne sat untouched on the polished table, its bubbles mirroring the turmoil within Ava. "It's a lot," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's distant hum. The plush velvet couch felt strangely cold beneath her. Julian moved to sit beside her, the soft rustle of his suit a gentle contrast to the city's vibrant pulse. "It's yours, Ava. It's a new beginning." He reached out, his touch hesitant yet comforting, tracing the rim of her glass. His gaze held a mixture of pride and concern. "Don't let this define you," he said softly, his voice laced with a profound understanding of the weight of this unexpected inheritance. "It's not just about the money. It's about the acknowledgement, the validation." Ava stared out at the cityscape, its dazzling lights suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the vastness of her own internal conflict. The years of being overlooked, of her talent minimized, the sting of Arthur's public humiliation, they all swirled within her, a complex tapestry of hurt and anger. "I don't know if I can," she started, her voice trembling, the weight of expectation heavy on her shoulders. Julian's hand covered hers, his touch unwavering. "You can, Ava. You're stronger than you think. And you won't be alone." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of his unwavering support. A promise whispered amidst the city's glittering distractions. The faint scent of old books mingled with the subtle aroma of expensive cologne, creating a strangely comforting blend in the spacious apartment. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental journey they had both endured. The city lights twinkled, a silent testament to their victory, and the promise of a future yet unwritten. The judge's words, crisp and official, hung in the air like shards of glass. In favor of Ava Du Bois, the courtroom erupted. A wave of sound gasps, murmurs. The sharp intake of breaths crashed over Ava. She felt Julian's hand, a vice-like grip in hers, a grounding presence amidst the chaos. The victory felt less like a triumphant crescendo and more like a final, exhausted sigh. The scent of expensive perfume and polished wood, usually luxurious, now felt cloying, suffocating. Arthur, his face a mask of stunned fury, sat rigidly, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his defeat heavy on him. His carefully constructed world, built on privilege and prejudice, had crumbled. Leaving the courtroom, the city's cacophony felt jarring after the tense silence. Ava felt the weight of the verdict settle upon her, a physical burden. The expensive car, provided by Julian's lawyer, seemed alien, the plush leather cold against her skin. Julian, beside her, radiated a tense calm, his eyes reflecting the city's blurred lights. "It's surreal," Ava finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. The champagne he'd offered earlier sat untouched, a reminder of the celebration they hadn't felt capable of. "I know," Julian replied, his voice soft, laced with a weary understanding. "But it's done. It's over." He glanced at her, his eyes searching hers. "It's a new beginning, Ava. Really." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise against the vast uncertainty that still loomed. The city lights, normally sparkling with seductive promise, seemed muted, dimmed by the weight of their victory. Ava stared out the window, the city a swirling blur, the enormity of what had happened slowly dawning upon her. The money, the inheritance, felt secondary. The real victory lay in the acknowledgement, the validation, the dismantling of Arthur's arrogance and the prejudices he represented. This was more than just a financial win. It was a statement, a testament to her strength and resilience. The journey had been arduous, but it had, unexpectedly, brought her a new brother, and that, she realized, was worth more than anything. The penthouse suite felt vast and empty, despite the opulent furnishings. Ava traced the rim of a crystal glass, the chill seeping into her fingers, mirroring the coldness that still clung to her heart. The victory felt hollow, the champagne untouched. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The city lights, a glittering tapestry below, seemed to mock her uncertainty. Julian, sensing her turmoil, moved closer. He sat beside her, the plush sofa sinking gently beneath their weight. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said softly, his hand resting lightly on hers. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed." His gaze held hers, warm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the stark, sterile luxury surrounding them. The silence stretched, filled only with the low hum of the city and the quiet rhythm of their breaths. Ava looked down at her hands, noticing the faint tremor in her fingers. "Half of his empire. It's a lot," she breathed, the weight of the inheritance pressing down on her. The money represented far more than mere wealth. It represented a lifetime of overlooked talent, of subtle slights and blatant prejudice, finally acknowledged. "It's yours," Julian stated simply, his voice firm, yet laced with understanding. "But it doesn't define you, Ava. You earned this not just because of the DNA, but because of who you are." His words resonated, a balm to her bruised spirit. The weight shifted. The focus turned inward, from external validation to a deeper understanding of herself. A silent promise passed between them, a shared understanding that transcended the courtroom's drama and embraced a future defined by their newfound bond. forged in the fires of injustice and tempered by a hard-won victory. The city lights, suddenly less intimidating, became a symbol of the opportunities that lay ahead, vast and uncertain, yet filled with a newfound hope. The morning sun, a pale imitation of the city's glittering night, cast long shadows across Ava's penthouse. The opulent space, once a symbol of her victory, now felt suffocating. She sat at the vast mahogany desk, the legal documents spread before her like a battlefield map. Each clause, each carefully worded sentence, represented a mountain of wealth, a lifetime of injustice finally rectified. But the victory tasted like ash. Julian arrived, carrying 2 steaming mugs. The aroma of strong coffee filled the air, a welcome counterpoint to the sterile scent of polished wood and expensive leather. He placed a mug beside her, his hand brushing hers briefly. The contact sparked a jolt of electricity, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. "Sleep at all?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes reflecting genuine concern. Ava managed a weak smile. "Not much. It all feels surreal." "I understand," Julian said, settling into a chair opposite her. He watched her, his gaze searching, empathetic. "The money, it's a lot to process. It's more than just numbers on a page." Ava nodded, her gaze dropping to the documents. "It's a lifetime of being overlooked, of being judged before I even open my mouth. Now it's all thrown at me. And you don't have to accept it all at once," Julian added gently, his words a soothing balm. "Take your time. You can use this to create something truly meaningful, something that helps others avoid what you went through." A flicker of hope ignited in Ava's eyes. The weight of the inheritance still pressed upon her, but a new perspective began to take root. She looked at Julian, truly seeing him for the first time since the gala. Not just as her half-brother, but as a confidant, a friend, a comrade in this unexpected fight for justice. The city outside, no longer a symbol of her loneliness, shimmered with potential. The vast empire, once a symbol of her father's prejudice, now held the power for genuine change. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer felt quite so daunting. It felt possible. The penthouse suite hummed with a quiet energy, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged through the courtroom. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape, painted stripes across the polished floor. Ava, curled on a plush sofa, stared blankly at the cityscape. The weight of her inheritance pressed heavily, a suffocating blanket of wealth. The scent of lilies, usually calming, now felt cloying, a symbol of the opulent cage she'd found herself in. Julian entered, the quiet click of his shoes on the polished marble floor the only sound. He carried a tray laden with delicate pastries, their aroma a fleeting moment of sweetness amidst the bitterness. He placed it on the coffee table, his movements gentle, his eyes filled with a deep empathy that resonated more profoundly than any spoken word. "I brought you something," he said softly, his voice a calming balm. "To celebrate, I suppose." A hesitant smile touched his lips, a fragile thing in the face of their shared ordeal. Ava managed a weak smile in return, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Celebrate? Yes," she whispered, picking up a tiny, exquisitely crafted macaron. The delicate sweetness did little to soothe the bitter taste in her mouth. The victory felt hollow, the legal battle a brutal fight that had left her emotionally exhausted. "It's not just about the money, is it?" Julian asked, settling beside her. The plush cushions sank beneath his weight, a shared silent acknowledgement of their shared exhaustion. Ava nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "It's about everything. About the years of being overlooked, of being judged, of being treated as if I didn't belong. It's about proving him wrong, but at what cost?" The city lights twinkled below, their brilliance a mocking reminder of the wealth that now felt like a burden. Julian took her hand, his touch firm yet gentle, a comforting weight against the turmoil within her. "You proved him wrong, Ava. You won. And you can use this to help others, to make sure no one else has to endure what you did." His words, simple yet profound, struck a chord. A new purpose began to take shape in her heart, a flicker of hope against the ashes of her past. The fight for justice had only just begun. The penthouse suite, a sanctuary of polished marble and panoramic city views, felt less like a haven and more like a gilded cage. Ava traced the rim of a champagne flute, the icy liquid doing little to quench the burning thirst in her throat. The victory felt hollow, the champagne tasteless. The weight of her inheritance, a vast fortune, pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of wealth. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, more to herself than to Julian. He sat across from her, the soft glow of the city lights illuminating the lines of worry etched on his face. "I know," he replied, his voice gentle. He reached across the polished table, his hand covering hers briefly. "But it's also a chance to do something extraordinary." Ava looked at him, her gaze lingering on his concerned features. The shared ordeal had forged an unexpected bond between them, a connection stronger than blood, yet born from it. "I don't know, Julian. I'm still processing everything." She swirled the champagne, the bubbles mirroring the turmoil inside her. The memory of Arthur's hateful words, his sneering contempt, still stung. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," he said softly, his voice a reassuring balm. "Just breathe, let it sink in, and then, when you're ready, we'll figure out what to do next." He leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that eased some of the icy dread. Ava nodded slowly, the weight of her past and present settling heavily in her chest. The legal battle had been exhausting, a grueling fight that had left her drained. But the quiet strength in Julian's eyes offered a flicker of hope. The victory wasn't just about the money. It was about justice, about proving that her worth wasn't determined by someone else's prejudiced gaze. It was about reclaiming her life, her identity, and maybe, just maybe, using this newfound power to help others. A slow smile crept across her lips, a tentative but genuine expression of hope emerging from the shadows of her past. The city lights, once mocking, now seemed to shimmer with possibility. The mahogany desk in Arthur's opulent study felt cold beneath Ava's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the heavy drapes, illuminating the room's hushed grandeur. The silence, thick with unspoken accusations, was almost unbearable. Arthur sat behind it, his face a mask of controlled fury, the once immaculate silver in his hair now streaked with gray. He hadn't spoken since the verdict. I don't understand," he finally rasped, his voice cracking like brittle ice. The words hung in the air, heavy with denial and a desperate clinging to a shattered reality. His gaze, usually sharp and assessing, was now clouded with a bewildering mix of pain and resentment. Ava met his gaze, her own eyes mirroring the storm within her. The victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic triumph. "There's nothing to understand, Arthur," she said, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. The weight of the past, of his prejudice, pressed down on her. "The DNA test was conclusive. Julian is your son, and I am your daughter." He scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the cavernous room. "A mistake. Fabrication. They're lying." His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a way out of this brutally exposed truth. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the opulent life built on lies. "It's not a mistake, Arthur," Julian said, stepping forward, his voice filled with a quiet strength Ava hadn't noticed before. He stood beside her, a silent ally against the storm brewing around them. "The truth has a way of surfacing, eventually." He looked at his father, a complex mixture of sadness and disappointment etched on his face. "And you can't erase it." Arthur stared at his son, the carefully constructed facade of his life crumbling around him. The years of carefully cultivated prejudice, the ingrained disdain, now felt like a heavy cloak he couldn't shed. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow to his already fractured self-image. He looked at Ava again, his eyes finally softening, a flicker of something akin to recognition replacing the ingrained contempt. Not remorse, not yet, but a crack in the wall, a glimmer of the truth beginning to penetrate the carefully constructed lies he'd lived by. The weight of his past actions, the sheer magnitude of his deception, seemed to finally settle upon him. The gilded cage he'd built had imploded, and he stood exposed, stripped bare of his wealth, his reputation, and most importantly, his own carefully crafted lies. The courtroom's hushed expectancy hung heavy, a palpable tension woven from the interwoven threads of anticipation and dread. Ava, her hand resting lightly on Julian's, felt the tremor in his grip. The judge's voice, crisp and final, shattered the silence. In favor of the plaintiff, a ripple of murmurs snaked through the gallery, a silent wave crashing against the shores of Arthur's meticulously crafted world. His face, pale and drawn, reflected the stark reality of defeat. He had lost not just a fortune, but a carefully constructed identity. Later, in a quiet corner of the bustling city, the three of them sat, the aftermath of the verdict settling like a thick fog. Julian, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with a pensive quietude, watched Ava, the woman who had borne the brunt of his father's prejudice, now holding the legal document that was also a testament to her resilience. The city lights twinkled outside, a stark contrast to the shadow of their shared trauma. I don't know what to do," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the restaurant. The weight of the inheritance, the vast sum that represented years of injustice, pressed down on her. She traced the elegant script of her name on the paperwork, her gaze distant, lost in a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. Julian reached across the table, his hand covering hers, a silent gesture of support. "It's your decision, Ava. There's no right or wrong answer," he said, his voice low and soothing. He understood the burden she carried, the moral weight that accompanied the financial windfall. He had seen the pain etched in her eyes, the internal struggle between rightful compensation and the injustice it symbolized. Arthur, across from them, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the swirling ice in his glass. The carefully constructed facade of arrogance and disdain had crumbled, leaving a hollow shell of a man, consumed by the ghosts of his own making. The remnants of his carefully cultivated persona could no longer mask the years of deception and prejudice, only the hollow echo of what he once was. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, a silent admission of a life lived in denial. He understood the truth but could not process the grief it had wrought. The city lights continued to shimmer, a kaleidoscope of hopes and dreams, offering a glimpse of a path toward a future he could never have imagined, one that did not exclude others. The silence hung heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of glasses, a counterpoint to the symphony of emotions playing out between them. The weight of the past hung in the air. The future, however, remained unwritten, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the strokes of forgiveness, reconciliation, and a hope for redemption. The restaurant hummed with a low, convivial thrum, a stark contrast to the storm raging within Ava. The city lights, blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirrored the uncertainty swirling in her mind. She picked at her untouched food, the delicate aroma of truffle oil lost on her. The verdict felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. "It's a lot of money," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's gentle murmur. Julian nodded, his gaze soft. The usual light in his eyes was dimmed, replaced with a quiet understanding. "It is, but it's also a recognition of what you've endured, Ava, of the injustice you suffered." He squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of his support. Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on his untouched glass of amber liquid. The city's glittering tapestry seemed to mock his defeat. The carefully constructed walls of his life, built on denial and prejudice, had crumbled, leaving him exposed to the raw, unfiltered reality of his actions. He could feel the weight of years of deception pressing down, the years of ignoring the subtle whispers of his conscience that now screamed in deafening silence. Ava's eyes, reflecting the city's shimmering lights, held a flicker of resolve. The money wasn't just about her. It was a symbol. "I want to use it," she said, her voice gaining strength, "to create opportunities, to help others who faced the same kind of prejudice." A small smile touched her lips, a fragile flower pushing through the hardened earth of her past. Julian's face lit up, a spark of hope igniting the shadows in his eyes. That's incredible, Ava." He reached across the table, his touch warm and reassuring. "I'll help you however I can." Arthur finally spoke, his voice rough with unspoken remorse. I'm sorry." The words were barely a breath, a whisper lost in the gentle din of the restaurant. Yet, in the quiet space between them, they held a profound weight. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to the personal revolution unfolding within the walls of that small restaurant. The past was etched in stone, but the future, like the city lights, held the promise of untold possibilities. The weight of the verdict was still heavy, but now it felt different, not as a burden, but as a tool, a lever to lift up others, to change a world that had wronged her, and possibly redeem the man who had hurt her most. The mahogany of Arthur's study felt cold beneath Ava's fingertips. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars, seemed to suffocate her. Arthur sat behind his massive desk, his face a mask of controlled fury, the expensive tailored suit doing little to hide the tremor in his hands. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a stark contrast to the darkness swirling within the room. This is a mistake," Arthur finally rasped, his voice a low growl. The words hung in the air, brittle and fragile. He gestured towards the DNA report, lying on the desk like a damning accusation. Ava met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. "It's not a mistake, Arthur. It's the truth." The weight of years of injustice, of being dismissed and overlooked, lent her voice an unexpected strength. "Truth," he scoffed, the sound harsh and brittle. "You think you can just waltz in here with this fabricated evidence and claim half my empire?" His voice cracked, betraying the carefully constructed facade of control. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his fingers leaving a trail of disarray. Julian, standing silently beside Ava, felt a pang of sympathy for his father, mingled with a surge of righteous anger. He saw the hurt, the fear beneath the bluster, but he also saw the stubborn refusal to accept responsibility, the ingrained prejudice that still clung to him like a shroud. Ava's expression softened slightly. "It's not about the empire, Arthur. It's about acknowledging what you did, the pain you caused. It's about finally facing the truth." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And it's about me, about the woman you humiliated, the woman you dismissed because of the color of her skin." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her gaze remained locked on his, steady and defiant. The silence returned, heavier this time, thick with unspoken accusations and long-suppressed emotions. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to amplify the weight of the moment, each tick a hammer blow against the decaying walls of Arthur's carefully constructed world. The sunlight, once a symbol of hope, now cast long, accusing shadows across the room. The confrontation had begun, and the truth, like a relentless tide, was beginning to wash away the lies. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Ava, perched on the edge of her seat, felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The air, thick with anticipation, tasted metallic. Julian, beside her, squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of support. His knuckles were white, betraying his own anxiety. Judge Thompson's voice, clear and resonant, cut through the tension. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." A wave of relief, so profound it felt almost physical, washed over Ava. It wasn't just about the money, though the financial security it provided was undeniable. It was the validation, the acknowledgement that her worth wasn't determined by Arthur's prejudiced gaze. Later, in the quiet solitude of her hotel room, the enormity of her victory sank in. The city lights twinkled outside, a glittering backdrop to the turmoil within. She touched the DNA report, a tangible symbol of her newfound identity, of a past she never knew. A tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of catharsis. Julian arrived, bearing coffee and a tentative smile. "It's over," he said softly, his voice laced with relief. The weight of the past few months seemed to lift from his shoulders. He watched her, concern etched on his face. "How are you truly feeling?" Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. I feel free," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Free from the shadow of his judgment. Free to be myself." She paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "But it's bittersweet, isn't it? A victory born of such pain." Julian nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew the battle had left scars, but it had also forged a bond between them, stronger than blood. "We did it together," he said, his voice firm, "and we'll face whatever comes next together." He reached out, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch, a simple gesture, conveyed the profound depth of their connection. The fight was won, but their journey was only just beginning. A path paved with healing and the promise of a future unburdened by prejudice. The courtroom's hushed silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock, each second amplifying the tension. Ava felt Julian's hand, a comforting weight in hers. He squeezed, a silent affirmation of their shared journey. Judge Thompson's words, "The plaintiff is awarded half of Arthur Beaumont's estate," hung in the air, a decree that resonated far beyond the legal confines of the room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a poignant metaphor for the scattered remnants of Arthur's carefully constructed life. Later, in the celebratory quiet of a private dining room, champagne flutes clinked, a brittle counterpoint to the profound emotions swirling within Ava. The victory felt hollow, tinged with a sadness that clung to her like the scent of old parchment. "It's overwhelming," she murmured, staring at the swirling amber liquid. The taste was flat, unlike the celebratory fizz she'd imagined. Julian, watching her closely, reached across the small table. "It's okay to feel this way, Ava," he said gently, his voice a soft balm against the raw edges of her emotions. His touch was warm, a quiet reassurance in the face of the overwhelming victory. "You deserve this. You've earned this." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, a tear that spoke volumes of the pain endured, the battles fought, and the monumental strength she discovered within herself. "It's more than just the money, Julian," she whispered, her voice catching. "It's the validation, the knowing that my worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice. The weight of years of silent battles, of internalized prejudice, lifted slightly. The champagne remained untouched. The victory, however sweet, tasted of ashes. The city lights outside were blurred through her unshed tears. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun. The celebratory dinner felt more like a wake. The opulent restaurant, usually a vibrant hub of laughter and clinking glasses, felt muted, the chatter a low hum against the weight of their victory. Ava traced the rim of her untouched champagne flute, the polished crystal cold against her fingertips. The city lights outside blurred through a film of unshed tears. "It's not what I expected," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper above the soft jazz music. Julian nodded, understanding etched on his face. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch, a stark contrast to the chill in the air, was a lifeline. "It's okay to feel this way," he said softly, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the opulent surroundings. "This isn't just about the money, is it?" Ava shook her head, the movement slow, deliberate. "It's about validation, about proving that my worth wasn't determined by his hateful words, his prejudiced gaze. It's about showing others that silence doesn't protect you. It allows the ugliness to fester." She squeezed his hand, a silent admission of the emotional toll the battle had taken. The victory felt heavy, burdened by the weight of Arthur's actions, by the years of societal biases they had fought against. Julian leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And we did it, Ava. We fought and we won. We exposed his hypocrisy, his lies." He paused, then added quietly, "And we showed him that his money can't buy him immunity from the consequences of his actions." A faint smile touched his lips, a flicker of hope in the somber atmosphere. The champagne remained untouched, the celebratory fizz replaced by the bitter taste of justice served. But in the quiet understanding between them, in the shared strength that had carried them through the storm, lay the promise of a brighter future. A future where prejudice would no longer define their worth. The fight was over, but the healing, the real work, had only just begun. The following months were a blur of therapy sessions and quiet mornings spent sipping tea in Ava's sun-drenched apartment. The opulence felt less like a victory and more like a gilded cage. The city skyline, once a symbol of aspiration, now felt indifferent to her quiet triumphs. Julian, a constant presence, became her anchor. Their bond, forged in the crucible of the legal battle, deepened into a profound sibling connection. He helped her navigate the complexities of managing her inheritance, patiently explaining financial statements, his touch occasionally brushing hers as he pointed to a chart. The physical contact, once tentative, felt increasingly natural, a silent testament to their shared journey. One evening, while reviewing the charitable foundation she'd established, a direct result of her father's shocking prejudice, Ava found Julian standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. "It's strange," he murmured, turning to her, his eyes filled with a quiet melancholy. "To see all this and feel so little." Ava walked over, placing a hand on his arm. "I know," she whispered, understanding flooding her. "The money doesn't erase the pain, the injustice." He nodded slowly. "Dad's regret. It's a shadow. I see it in his eyes, in the way he avoids my gaze. It doesn't make what he did right, but..." He trailed off, searching for the right words, his voice catching. "It's a start. A terrifying, flawed start, but a start nonetheless." The city lights reflected in his eyes, a shimmer of unshed tears. The weight of his father's actions, the betrayal, the years of unspoken family secrets, it all hung heavy in the air. Ava squeezed his hand, offering silent comfort. "We'll face it together," she promised, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. The shared burden, the shared victory, the shared pain, forged a bond that money couldn't buy, a family built not on blood alone, but on shared resilience and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The city lights twinkled, indifferent yet beautiful, a silent witness to their healing, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Their future wasn't defined by their past, but by the choices they made now together.